Hello, everybody. Like Jay said, I'm Justin. I wanted to introduce kind of some basic Zoom policy before we get started. I'm going to read this at the beginning of numerous. Hello, everybody. You're good. So we're kind of just trying to get ahead of things so that we can get really comfortable with the chat section and then with norms regarding like being muted.
It's pretty hard to hear you, Justin.
Really? We'll send you this. But by the end of the event, we'll be used to how this works and we'll figure it out. But just at the very beginning, I'm going to read this little blurb. So before we begin, we'd like to invite you to make sure that your mics are muted and your video is on. Though this residency is observing a hybrid in-person and online model, for those of us who are not yet vaccinated or comfortable attending live events, the purpose of this residency is to engage with each other, to learn together, and to share this space. So we encourage everybody to turn on their videos so long as you're able. And we would also like to remind you that throughout the duration of the residency, any speakers, readers, teachers, or hosts will not be closely monitoring the chat function on Zoom in real time. That does not mean that you can't use it. We have designated somebody to monitor all comments and questions in the chat section and read these aloud at designated times. So please note, if you have questions or comments you'd like to make, the chat space is still reserved for that purpose. And without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to Alison. So take it away.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Jay. Greetings to the new cohort, our 3 students. Congrats early for our inaugural graduating class. For my talk today, I am going to be utilizing the hour to basically present or lay before you some things that I've been ruminating on, particularly over the past year as they relate to water. So I think the best way for you to maybe utilize this time, I've put into the chat the PowerPoint. I can provide others that weren't able to see it or get it outside of the time. I will be available virtually in the Zoom cloud realm over the course of the residency and afterwards for those that want to continue to be in discourse with me about what you heard, with questions, comments, concerns. So I very much am of the belief that often creative writing and sometimes art making can seem solitary, but I do believe that I am in communion with a larger public or an ecosystem of people that are thinking, making, writing, and living in the world. And so that also extends to YouTube fam. You can find me on social media platforms. This is just the beginning of an ongoing discussion. So that being said, I'd like to start with something I experienced the poet Harriet Mullen doing before one of her talks, and that is to do a full body scan. So in wherever you are in the world, in the realm, in the classroom, in Portland, if you could just briefly do a scan from head to toe of your body. Often I like to think about if I'm having any tension in my jaw, releasing tension in my lower mouth. Sometimes if I sleep incorrectly, I have a particular crick in my neck. If I'm feeling any discomfort, just scanning how your physical body is, what it might be wanting to communicate or say, or make clear to you in this particular moment. Great. And maybe as a practice, you might do that every day during this residency or before every workshop, before every talk, just checking in with your body, its current pulse, its current capacity for what it is that's being asked of you, to make sure that we're leading with our bodies from a centered place rather than dictating or kind of often pushing through, which is what academia often requires us to do. All right, so I'm going to start with my PowerPoint here. And the title of this talk, for those of you that were able to read the blurb, is Undrowned: Wake, Work, water words. And this concept comes from a course that I taught this past year at Colorado College on Black environmental literature. And we focus specifically on texts that have to do with water, artistic practice, and literary works that are focused on water. And I also had the pleasure of working with one of the graduating students, Casey, who has a beautiful intro for those who will hopefully get to read it in his thesis that talks about a particular moment of loss in his family history as it relates to a flash flood, which I'll talk about in a few slides later. So I've turned my attention consciously and creatively towards water. And if you do that, things will continue to just bubble to the surface. Like this past week, I think there was a diver who I believe collected or gets lobsters off, I think it was in Maine, that was swallowed by a whale, like actually entirely swallowed by the whale, and then was rescued out of the inside of the whale. So I had just finished reading, I think earlier this year, I believe it's Edward Carey's novel called A Swallowed Man. And I was like, this is like, the genre bending is always applicable because nonfiction reaches fiction into poetry and back and forth. So it's really, really interesting to think about the ways that water, marine life intersects with our world. On this first slide, this image was actually taken by dear friend, fellow writer, the poet Danez Smith. And this is me on the back of a ferry traveling from Athens, Greece to Syros. And before I even knew what the word wake actually meant, or before I read some critical scholarship, which I'll show in this talk, I was just so captivated visually by the kind of path that the ferry was leaving in the sea as we traveled. And this notion of not being able to see the shoreline, just being on this boat headed in a trajectory towards what was to be like a vacation kind of writing retreat time. So this is actually a visual image of a wake, one in which I created pre-COVID many years ago now while traveling in Greece. Another figure who colors much of my writing and way of processing the world is Toni Morrison. And I think this quote is really pertinent in thinking about one of the ways I'm trying to conceptualize the use of water, especially as it relates to memory. And this is from one of Morrison's essays called The Site of Memory, and I will read this aloud. You know, they straightened out the Mississippi River in places to make room for houses and livable acreage. Occasionally, the river floods these places. Floods is the word they use, but in fact, it is not flooding. It is remembering where it used to be. All water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was. Writers are like that. Remembering where we were, that valley we ran through, what the banks were like, the light that was there, and the route back to our original place. It is emotional memory, what the nerves and the skin remember, as well as how it appeared. And a rush of imagination is our flooding. So this was really eye-opening for me and interesting in terms of thinking about flooding as an act of remembering, as water having a type of agency or autonomy to try to get back to the place from which it came, right? To think about what it might mean for us when we remember or draw from memories for our creative work, and what it might mean when we imagine or we create, we make manifest, we world build, also drawing from this same site of flooding, this overburdening or overwashing of liquid form, if you will. So in thinking about real life experience, nonfiction, when I was actually on this trip to Greece, I left behind a location where I was living with my partner in Chicago. And when I was on that trip, which was at least probably 2 weeks, the flood a flood occurred in the basement of that house. So there was constant torrential rain in Chicago. The sewer system, the drainage ended up getting backed up. And so there was probably water up to my kneecaps, like dark, murky water. And quite tragically, I'm professionally trained as a librarian. Most of my books that I had in kind of a storage capacity there were completely ruined. So mold, water. So there was this sight of loss, there was this sight of grief, there was this sight of overburdening or flooding water as I was vacationing or traveling on water, swimming daily, engaging in this vacation with a bunch of other creative writers. And so I was really interested in this distinction between what it means for something to flood, which is causing us trauma, turmoil, loss, in relationship to what it means to vacation on water, to engage with water in a playful, joyful, therapeutic, relaxing type energy, and what that means or does for the water and vice versa. I also became very interested recently as I began to read more, namely some literature on immigration policy, some literature on how fraught it is for people trying to travel or seek solace on land, how the Mediterranean Sea, for example, is a place that is very, very fraught, I'll use that term. And so what it means for me as a Black body, as an American, to be traveling, vacationing on a sea that occupies a lot of terror, a lot of displacement, a lot of disorientation for other bodies that look like me, also traveling across time and space on these particular planes. So these are snippets taken from the talk and what I'm going to try to attempt to do. So one is to think about bodies of water in a twofold manner. So one, that these refer to oceans, rivers, lakes, swamps, but also simultaneously to the human body, which we know is composed primarily of water. So we existing, being alive in the world, are actually comprised almost in a disproportionate amount of water. So we are moving ships, if you will, or moving containers, vessels of water on land. And then we are also in proximity or relationship to bodies of water in the natural world. So I, for instance, am near a lot of creeks in Colorado. I miss very much being near Lake Michigan. I grew up near the Mississippi River. So we often know or are aware of our proximity to also natural landscapes of water. I'm thinking also in this talk about the definition of wake, which is the track left by a moving body, such as a ship, in a fluid such as water. And then lastly in my talk, I want us to try to examine what wake we leave in our creative work, especially thinking about those that are moving on, that are graduating. What wake have you left in your current in terms of your artistic practice during your time and energy spent in this program? How can we think about what it is that we're leaving behind, as well as what we're carrying forward across time and space? In this talk, we'll look at ways that water is not only a metaphorical site, but also a site of trauma, a site of memory, rememory, loss, healing, and a material site. And then lastly, we're going to experiment and play, or I'm going to introduce you to some ideas to experiment and play with approaches to cross-genre writing, as well as artistic production that might center or focus on the ways of water. Okay, so one of the first things I'd like for you to do, and there might not be time to do these activities in their fullness, so we're kind of just making a sketch or just getting some ideas down. But the first thing I'd like for you to do is to make a water timeline. So if you have just a sheet of scrap paper or something to write on, if you were to draw or create a timeline, and because I often don't think of time linearly, so as a straight line, I often think of it as a spiral or some type of more messy, non-linear, non-straight moving line. But I'd like for you to make some type of visual timeline and to put 3 markers on it of importance to you. So for me, one, for example, when I graduated undergrad, which was, when was that? 2000, no, when I graduated high school, I'm sorry, which is 2005. I and two of my closest friends were headed to the East Coast. And then my other two closest friends were headed to New Orleans. They were going to go to Loyola, New Orleans for college. And Hurricane Katrina occurred, which asked or needed them to then reroute to Houston and one of them back to Missouri. So I distinctly remember graduating from high school, us going to Target, getting our comforters, getting our mini fridge things ready, getting our snacks, being super excited. And then that experience being greatly shaped by this natural disaster. So 2005 Hurricane Katrina. When I was first in grad school, which was maybe around, let's say 2011 or so, I had an apartment in Philadelphia, and I was one day getting ready to go to class, and the ceiling opened in my apartment. It literally puckered, created almost like a breast type shape, and water started gushing into my carpeted, which was probably like 1970s carpet. And so I had black mold in my apartment. I had to evacuate the apartment. It was a complete disaster on top of graduate school stress and having limited funds. So it's another moment of water for me. And then non-chronologically, I'll go to the year I was born, 1987. My mother's water broke when she was actually at a German festival, like street festival. And so she always reminds me that she was eating a bratwurst, and therefore made sure she finished eating the bratwurst before she was rushed to the hospital, which I think then created complications in terms of her being able to take medicine because she had eaten. So, and thinking about those three dates and their relationship to water, I'm thinking about how water has shaped my timeline, trajectory, life experiences. So you may also think about this in terms of your ancestry. So as I mentioned, working with the student Casey, his maternal grandparents actually passed away as a result of a flash flood. And so that changed the trajectory or responsibility of his mother in relationship to moving into kind of a leadership role in their family with this passing, this sudden and unexpected trauma or catastrophe. So you could think about this culturally. If you occupy or live, which most of us do, on unceded lands or territories of indigenous peoples, if you're engaged in activism related to water pipelines or to communities that are being actively cut off by the privatization of water. So we can make this very large in scope, very personal and familiar in scope, but we can make these different timelines or trajectories, ways of orienting and organizing time and space as it relates to water. Okay, so another activity connected to that is, what would it mean if you started to think about water as actually a site of memory and imagination? Memory perhaps as connected to the past or history, and imagination perhaps as like speculative, futuristic, you creating or convening something original or that wasn't here before. So as pervasive as water is, as pervasive and essential as water is to your own like bodily composition, what does it mean for memory and imagination to also occupy those spaces, for those words or terms or concepts to become interchangeable? And I'm curious if you could also jot down just orienting us to water in this moment, like with an awareness. So what is your actual distance right now to a water source? For some in a very urban space, it might be like, where's the nearest restroom or the nearest kitchen facility or kind of water spout or faucet? For those that maybe know where they are in proximity to a natural body of water, like what is your distance to an actual water source in this particular moment? Next, how much would it cost you to access this water? So what is the economic dollar amount, or what do you need to give or present in order to have access to that water? Next, how much time would it take you to get this water? Are you 3 minutes away, 4 hours away, a 1 hour plane flight? Like how long, how much time would it take you to access the water? Next, how easily could you access it? So what would be some perhaps barriers or challenges or particular things that might stand arguably between you and your access? Or is that access quite free and open and available? Then next, can you control the temperature of the water? So that water that you're thinking of or have in mind, do you have the ability to control or actually manipulate the temperature of it? And I'm just making a note that Sarah Bat, I do see your point about boats and funeral wakes, and I will address that at the end. Thank you. All right, so we don't have to necessarily do this, but I poured myself a glass of water into a clear, I'm sure this is probably like a cheap IKEA vessel. And I'm thinking about when I pour a glass of water, the notion that the water actually reflects its surroundings. It creates actually a mirror type relationship to the world around it, right? And I'm thinking often when I access water of its own energy or vibration. So what energy or vibration or charge I feel like this water is carrying, and what that does to my relationship to it. Like whether I view this water as aware or as this passive object that's just there for my consumption, right? Whether I view this water as a reflection and part of me already that's integral to my well-being and livelihood, or whether I view it as like a like I have to now drink this water. I grew up in a household where drinking water was, my mother doesn't like the taste of water, which is arguably tasteless. And so it was very much, we just didn't like water. If I could drink probably blue Powerade as my beverage of choice for hydration, I would all the time. So thinking about my relationship to just a glass of water as it exists. So with your findings that you wrote down from doing these sets of questions, your distance, the cost, the time, your access points, and the temperature of it, I'm wondering if we could briefly meditate for a second on what it would mean to replace that water source with your creative mind. So if we think about the distance to your memory or to your imagination, how far are you in any given moment from accessing a memory? How far are you in any given moment from creating an original or imaginative idea? How much does it cost you to travel back in time and to access a memory for your creative work? What costs are there? What things are at stake? How much does it cost you to imagine? For some people, it's like, I need someone to watch my children. I need to have a free room with access to myself for a moment. I need to be hydrated. I need to have something to eat. Like, what are the things that you need, the requirements, the economic value that you need to be in a space to imagine, to actually take yourself mentally outside of maybe the lived experience or the present? How much time does it take you to access your memories? How much time does it take you to imagine? One of the most frustrating things for me in writing a book is people often ask, like, how long did it take you to write the book? And it's like, I don't know, however old I am right now. Like, it's it's all been a culmination, right? But because we are often existing in a capitalist driven society, people want to know how, like, literally how long did it take? Was it 3 years? Was it a decade? You need to be able to numerically assign a value to how long something's taking. So you might be involved in a lifelong imaginative creative process that doesn't necessarily have a product or consumer good, but it's part of a time frame that is way larger than the scope of this program, for example. Then I want you to think about ways that you access your memory and imagination and how easy that is for you to do. Often when I'm working with undergraduate students that are taking an English class or a creative writing class because they were required to, or because they think that it's easy, it is very hard to get those students to access their imagination. There's often a lot of things mentally, experientially, educationally that stand as a barrier in terms of students' ability to reach into their imagination. For some of you, that might not be the case at all, right? You're very prone, you've been encouraged, you like to engage in creative play. So thinking about what are some of the barriers that are self-imposed, barriers that are externally imposed, that stand in the way of your access points to memory and imagination. And then I haven't quite figured out what I mean by temperature, but I'm curious about what it means to have access to cold water and hot water. And what I maybe mean by that in terms of creative process. So cold water being in some ways jarring or shocking to the senses, or hot water as perhaps like soothing and easing kind of aches and pains in the body. So like when you're engaged in imaginative production, does that feel hot or cold? Like, what does that feel like? When you're engaged in traveling back in time or accessing memories, does that often feel like a hot or a cold experience to you? And what knowledge of those trips mentally, like what that does to us in terms of our process. And Russell, I also see your note, thanks. Okay, so next, I want us to jot down some things that we think about over the period of an average month as it connects to water. So I've put here for you just some examples of things that, I don't know, one might have to consider in a month from a day-to-day perspective as it relates to water. So things like my water bill is going to be due sometime during the month. I need to drink water every day when I'm exercising, especially. I like to have a hot tea sometimes at night. I had an apple and some strawberries earlier today, so those had to be washed off and cleaned. If you have a pet or animals that you're taking care of, they probably need daily fresh water. I have 2 Brita water filters that I keep full in my refrigerator. Often I'm taking a shower every day. I brush my teeth. I use the bathroom multiple times a day. If you have plants, you're watering your plants. Earlier today, it looks like it was definitely going to rain and might later. I might take a walk later and encounter that rain. For some of us, we may be in zones where we're experiencing still like basement flooding or water leaking or things coming into the house because of precipitation or whatnot that we don't necessarily want or hadn't expected. So if you could just jot down a few things, and this can be an ongoing list, a way to kind of register or archive, collect the ways in which water is consciously impacting your life on a daily basis. And then the next step of that, which we won't have time for, but you can do, is to think about what emotions are attached to those experiences. So often I view drinking water as a nuisance. My partner often has to remind me or ask me, Allison, have you drank any water, or bring me water, because I won't necessarily do it on my own. I think often about using the toilet and plumbing, because earlier this year I did a survival course where I had no access to running water, and I also had no toilet paper. I was using like river rocks. And so now I have a different proximity or gratitude in terms of plumbing or being able to use the bathroom when I want to in privacy, and actually have toilet paper and the ability to flush it. So thinking about where you are in space and time and how that impacts your connection to the water, your relationship to it. Okay, so there's, as I said in the blurb for this talk, there's kind of 4 primary texts or books that have really shaped my thinking over this past year. And the first, I recommend all of them, but the first is Alexis Pauline Gumbs' book called Undrowned: Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals. I've been on a kick recently where like I can't get enough of like cephalopods. I bought all these books on eels that I don't have time to read. So I'm really interested in marine life, particularly as it relates to kind of what would we call, I guess, non-normative ways of being as it relates to human beings, or like the US American experience. So I've culled 4 particular quotes from the text that I think are really important that I wanted to share with you all. So the first is Gums writes, nothing is objective. In this book, I move mostly from a clinical tone to a profoundly intimate tone. The words "I love you" appear more than any other phrase in this book. So what I love about this book is that Gums is consciously engaging in research. She's presenting research or her findings on marine life, but she is conscious of situating it in terms of an emotional register of love. And often our relationship to research is one of like sterileness, objectivity, supposed objectivity. It's not one of valuing emotion or expressing a great amount of passion, love, interest, curiosity. And so what does it mean to orient yourself from a loving place as it relates to research or as it relates to understanding or learning things about the natural world? Next, Gums writes, sorry, my hope, my grand poetic intervention here is to move from identification, also known as that process through which we say what is what, like which dolphin is that over there and what are its properties, to identification, italicized, that process through which we expand our empathy and the boundaries of who we are become more fluid because we identify with the experience of something different, maybe someone of a whole different so-called species. So much of learning is our ability to, like, when we're bird watching, be able to identify what type of bird is that? Where is it normally located? What are its properties? Like, we're interested in kind of naming and dictating, creating parameters of something. But what does it mean to move from that type of identification to one that's actually expanding empathy? Or seeing boundaries as much more fluid, not seeing ourselves as separated from things and the need to name or dictate or create the parameters and distinctions of things, but to see ourselves as kind of interconnected and flowing in fluid motion within, around, sensing the world rather than as isolated or separate from it. Okay, so the next 2 points Gums makes that I want to look at are at the same time, as I learned more about marine mammals, I learned to look between the loopholes of language, using the poetic practices I have had to use to find and love myself in a world that misnames me daily. So I'm interested in this notion of loopholes of language. What are these loopholes or gaps or spaces that are kind of slippery that we can slide inside of, crevices that we can get in that kind of disorient or move around or disrupt a world or a lived experience in which we are being read in ways that are incorrect or that we don't own or claim. And then lastly is this notion of echolocation. Instead of simply identifying what was what, I had to go deeper. I took my cue from the many marine mammals who echolocate. I had to focus not on what I could see and discern, but instead on where I was in relation, how the sound bouncing off of me in relationship to the structures and environments that surround me locates me in a constantly shifting relationship to you, whoever you are by now. So I could talk for hours about this concept of echolocation. In my class, I actually just had students, rather than write papers, they did what I call these echolocation exercises. So I'm really interested in this notion of what would it mean to think about our creative process as dealing with sound bouncing off of us in relationship to structures and environments, like collecting and reading these sound waves, collecting and seeing these sound waves and translating them into a poem, translating them into a short story, etc. So to try to make this make a little more clear sense, Jay in our texting, which we do over the years, sent me or reminded me of the Chilean artist Cecilia Vicuna. And he sent me this particular video, which I think speaks so beautifully and fluidly to this notion of what I would like to think of as an artistic practice of echolocation. And I'm going to play it for you. It's not too long, but in it, Vicuna says, "The way I came to a method was through listening. My process is not thinking. My process is sensing, attending to that is around us, in our field of love, I could say, things that you love. And she talks about this process of being a teenager and beginning to suddenly have this sense that like the mountains are aware, the sea, the ocean is aware. All these things are also actively aware. And so I'm actually just moving through the world, sensing and feeling the invisible sound waves of everything's awareness. And then that's how I create. That's my process. It's not a conscious thinking. It's not a thing I have control over. It's not a thing I need to name. It's not a thing I need to attach like philosophical thoughts or Foucault or Hegel to necessarily. It's a process of listening. It's a process of attending and being present. So I'm going to share the video with you all just briefly. One moment. So this is Vicuna talking about creative process as it relates to what I just described.
The way I came to a method was through listening. I just follow what it wants. If it's going to be a song, if it's going to be a murmur, if it's going to be a drawing, my process is not thinking. My process is sensing, attending to that is around us in our field of love, I would say. The things that you love. I can tell you a scene. I am in the South Pacific, in Chile, in the beach. I am maybe 17 years old, and I was playing in the beach, and suddenly the movement of the wind around my waist made me feel that the wind was sensing me, feeling me. And I looked into the sea, and I felt that the sea was also aware. And I suddenly became aware all in one blow that everything was aware. And I understood in that moment that my awareness was possible because everything was aware. I felt such awe and reverence in front of that I kneeled down and I grabbed a little palito, I call them little sticks that are lying around, and I planted it, made it vertical. In 1966, that is the birth of the precarios. Precario means fragile. It means something that disappears. In high school, we studied that Chile was becoming a desert as a result of colonization. And so water was already becoming scarce back in the 60s. You fast forward to the military coup in Chile, 73, and the dictatorship privatized water. The precarious instantly became a prayer for the well-being of water, became an offering for the restoration of the life force of the water. And to this day, I sense what is happening to water as if it was happening inside of me. Quipu is an ancient system that the pre-Columbian people developed in Peru, and it is a form of record keeping that inscribed information through tying knots on threads. So information was encoded in such complex ways that it has as many iterations as the alphabetic system in terms of all that can be encoded in knots and turns and twists. I began doing quipus in the 60s. When I returned to Chile, I began creating these sort of quipus that are composed of people, where instead of me creating knots in threads, I would weave people. I suppose I began first as a political act of joining people together as a way of going against the Western idea of separation, of individualism, and so forth. But eventually, this became something deeper than that, even, which is connecting our collective body to the movement of water. Mapocho is the river at which side I was born. It connects the glacier of El Plomo to the Pacific Ocean, and it passes through the middle of Santiago. This river is sort of disappearing from drought, global warming, and this kidnapping of water by privatization. I have done very many rituals there, but the Quipu Mapocho consisted in doing 8 or 9 performances all the way from the glacier to the ocean and in all those middle points. And in most of those points, I would do it with large groups of people woven together, weaving their bodies to the water, symbolically or literally. The awareness that the Valley of Santiago used to be a sacred landscape, not only for the ancient people that were originally there, but also to the Incas, was completely erased by colonial Western culture. I want to bring this awareness that the sacred landscape was still alive and still with us and still speaking to us if we just listened to it.
Okay, wonderful. So I'll take us back to our slideshow. Oh, wait, hold on. Okay, so in the file I have for you, in this right corner then, there's a company called Enso Apothecary. It's a Black-owned business in, I believe, Fort Worth, Texas. And they have taken sapo, which is a West African word for sponge. It's actually a bathing practice that's fairly ancient, using knitted, I guess you would say, I don't know, cloth, a structure. And it might be hard to see on my screen, but these are actually knots made into the fabric to create a kind of like open face loofah, if you will. And so these are fairly affordable. They last for, I'm told through the company, 2 to 3 years. And they, I don't know, you can read about the properties of them later. I don't manufacture textiles, but this is something that I've incorporated as a daily ritual, inspired by the quipu notion of record keeping. So this form of knots that allows one to form a language or archive system. I've actually kind of chosen to interpret or remix that thought in terms of a cleansing or a washing away. And so I'm thinking of the knots or the quipu system as a way to remove, to discard, to forget, to cleanse, to like renew things that I do not want to carry with me or do not want to record or archive moving forward. So this is just one example of a way to kind of interpret a ritual, a lived experience ritual that then may be connected to being in the world and therefore artistic practice. And I'm going to just jump to one moment. My applications of this in terms of a prompt. Okay, so for most of the concepts I talk about in the slideshow or the PowerPoint, there's often prompts. So one thing I had my students do this past year, which was literally mind-blowing, I had to keep myself from crying, was have students think about ways to engage in art process or making that really actually values ephemeral art or work that, as Vicuna is saying with precarios, is fragile, that disappears, that is designed to disintegrate or to interact with the world. So I had one student that actually, she was a neuroscience major, and she knitted from a particular very fragile fabric, coral reef. And the coral reef, she interpreted or was reading actually as the human brain. And so it had all these beautiful and intricate folds in terms of her textile practice that she was relating actual to our still lack of understanding about a lot of aspects of the human brain, or how the human brain processes and organizes information. And it was just mind blowing to see her use her art practice as it connects to the study of neuroscience, which I do not do and I'm not formally doing. One way to think about this in terms of a prompt would be, how could you create a piece of ephemeral art or performance art that collaborates or engages and interacts with the natural external world, right? What would it mean to design it in a way that it's actually going to be impacted by the natural environment in a way that we want to occur or happen, or a way that we would kind of value? What would it mean to create something that's actually not designed to be long lasting? Its function is actually to disappear, to fall apart, to disintegrate. And I'm really thinking about this a lot in terms of my practice and my relationship to publication, because I think there's a lot of value in celebrating and thinking about impermanence. There's a Japanese aesthetic practice that's connected to transience and imperfection, rather than perfection or standardization and notion of imperfection, through wabi-sabi. And so I have just some questions here at the bottom, and a ritual that I encourage you all also to try if you are able. With my students, I took these banana peppers that you see here, and I cut them in half. And we went to a water source here in Colorado. And for those that were not able to travel with us to the source of the water, we did these rituals to the pepper boats before, and then we set them out onto the creek. And so there's a twofold process in terms of thinking about what you would like to release or forget, let go of, and what are things that you might want to keep or remember, or that you would like to live forever in perpetuity. And then we set these peppers onto the stream. And so by now, I mean, this was months ago, so I don't know where the peppers are. I don't know if trout or something ate the peppers, or if they completely have disintegrated into the water ecosystem of this river stream, if they're still in their original form. But the desire, I didn't take photographs of it either. I didn't actually want it to be kind of archived to live in the cloud or on my phone or in any capacity. The moment was meant to be ephemeral. And in teaching myself as an educator and my students to kind of value or reorient ourselves to things that are not meant to last, or things that are actually designed to disintegrate or bleed into the natural landscape and world in ways that I can't register or track or assess or evaluate or get paid for, et cetera. And so it's something I'm trying to both encourage myself and people I'm in creative practice with to try as a concept. All right, so I have just a few more things I wanted to share. I get clearly too excited and have too many things in my mind, but it'll be okay. Okay, so a book that I highly recommend that is unfortunately out of print, I think at this point, is an early collection of Vicuna's work that is actually translated. It was published with Grey Wolf Press, and I just copied one page out of it that I wanted to share in relationship to this post I saw. I don't know, maybe this is Twitter, somewhere on the social media platform, about sperm whales. So this visual here is of sperm whales actually resting or napping, sleeping. And from what I'm told, I didn't fact check this, but it's fine because we're creatives, that they actually dive about 45 feet and arrange themselves in these level vertical patterns. And they do this in a pod formation. So there's 5 or 6 whales, presumably one might imagine for protection or to have a bit of a I don't know, communal sleep pattern rather than in singular form. And I'm interested about this in terms of the vertical sleeping, vertical rest, and this communal aspect and this diving, this going down to do this practice. And I connected it to this passage from Vicuna's Unraveling Words and the Weaving of Water, which I'll read aloud. So she writes, "To approach words from poetry is a form of asking questions. To ask questions is to fathom, to drop a hook to the bottom of the sea. The first questions appeared as a vision. I saw in the air words that contained at the same time both a question and an answer. I called them divinations. And the word said, the word is the divination. To divine is to ascertain the divine. Other numerical and calendrical systems speak of what has come or what will come, but only the word is the divination of what we are now and why." So some things to ponder I have here on the bottom. What questions does your work ask? How do you drop hooks to the bottom of the sea? How do you drop hooks into your memory? How do you drop hooks into your imagination? How do you divine? And also, how do you rest? I feel like we could all, as a culture, society, institutions, focus more on rest. What is our practice of rest? What is our activity of rest? How can we create equal value on the process or experience of resting? Okay, we looked at that already. And then I have just a brief note. There's a book called The Hidden Messages in Water by Masaru Emoto. And I'm fascinated about how this book is perceived in different types of communities or contexts. So for example, on Wikipedia, which we know is not like the most credible source, but I'm interested in terms of like public notions. Emoto is described as a Japanese businessman, author, and pseudoscientist who claimed that human consciousness could affect the molecular structure of water. And so in this book, we have different images. I've included one here for you, where to my understanding, water droplets were put into Petri dishes, and then somehow the water was shown images or communicated language or words. And then images were taken of the crystal structure the water formed after its response or after its presentation with these stimulus or stimuli, if you will. So this one is water shown a photograph of a dolphin. And it's noted here, dolphins are said to be as intelligent or as more intelligent than human beings and are said to have healing powers. This noble crystal seems to radiate with healing. And so what this book is doing, like its practice, is kind of presenting arguably an experiment, if you will, and then translating it into language and images, photography and language. And this being deemed as kind of pseudo-scientific, so like not real science, pretend science, or not scientifically grounded, is very interesting to me, especially because I know there's many folks in the program that are really interested in fantasy or speculative writing or science fiction, and how we construct or think about things as hard science versus soft science, scientific versus pseudo-scientific, what constitutes things that are respected, valued, and heard in scientific communities versus artistic communities. And so I've given just some things to think about in terms of like, what would it mean to translate water in artistic ways? What would it mean to collaborate with water in scientific/artistic ways? And I have an example of, I guess it's the science fiction text Solaris by Stanislaw Lem, which is a fascinating text because I believe it was originally published in Polish. And then this particular copy I have was translated to French from Polish, and then from that French to English. So there's multiple translations of the text. And what it's exploring is this psychologist's relationship to a planet that's entirely covered in ocean water. And so this is a nod to the science fiction speculative writers that I know are strong in the program, in terms of ways to think about this from a speculative lens, if you will. Okay, how am I on time? Okay, so a few more moments. I'll introduce this last concept that comes from Christina Sharp's In the Wake on Blackness and Being. This is a book that I highly, highly also recommend. Absolutely phenomenal. It's considered Black cultural literary studies, but is just groundbreaking in my opinion. And in this book, in a particular chapter, Sharp looks at the book Zong by Norbesi Philip, which is a text that's taking historical information, legal documents from a enslaving vessel, a slave ship that actually forcibly throwed enslaved African bodies overboard in order to collect insurance payments. And so Philip, who was actually trained as an attorney or practicing lawyer and now poet, was looking at those documents and trying to kind of create the voices or the personas, the experiences of these people that were on the ship and those thrown overboard. And so Sharp puts forth, using Philip, this notion of exagua. So what it means for our creative work, for our creative practice, to actually bring bodies back from the water, to actually resurrect or to resuscitate or to rebirth things that are lost, things that have been destroyed via trauma or disaster, what it might mean for us to kind of re-earth or re-emerge, resurrect things that have been kept silent, things that have been lost, things that have been disregarded previously. So I'm really interested in a practice of exagua. Like what might your work look like if it is committed to bringing bodies, bringing voices within yourself, outside of yourself, back from the dead, back from water. I have this other quote thinking us back to whales. This is from Sharp as well. And she says, there have been studies done on whales that have died and have sunk to the seafloor. These studies showed that within a few days, the whales' bodies are picked almost clean by benthic organisms, those organisms that live on the seafloor. Because nutrients cycle through the ocean, the atoms of those people who were thrown overboard are out there in the ocean even today. And so even back to your point or your question, Sarah Bat, in the chat related to funeral rites or funeral services that include water or the presentation of a body onto a ship or plank set out to sea, I began to think about the ocean or water as a site of a type of immortality, or a type of constant Lion King like circle of life existing within that plane that might be more complex or interesting than our traditional burial rites of putting someone in the ground. Now, I'm also very into mushrooms at the moment, so if people want to have discourse with me about mushrooms and networks, communication systems through fungal systems, we can also do that as well. But in this particular presentation, I'm interested in what would it mean for the things that we put into water or the things that are in water to always circle, to be connected to past, present, and inherently the future. For water to act kind of as this natural time capsule at all times, moving cyclically through time rather than linearly. And this is particularly affirming to me in thinking about my ancestors still alive in the ocean, if that makes sense, right? My ancestors still being in that space. Okay, so I've got some prompts that you can reflect on in your workshops over the course of your time during the residency. Yeah, I just tried to kind of synthesize or give some actual language to what is possible, what could be done in terms of actual writing practice. And then for the sake of, Jay gave me permission to go a couple minutes over. So I'll just look back at this, one of these prompt slides with you all together. Okay, so in that class, I was talking about It was fascinating the way we began to understand water as a type of mother. The language we also have starting like Mother Earth, Mother Nature, virgin soil, like the language we have that kind of uses particular feminized language and pronouns as it relates to water and natural land, but also water as a site of death and destruction and catastrophe. So what would it mean in your work to kind of meditate on connecting both life and death as it relates to the plane of water? I'm still kind of haunted. I don't think this was Sarah's intention, but last residency, which she read from, I think, a work in progress of fiction, one of the characters didn't wash their hands when they returned back to where they were. And so in thinking also about pandemic living, like what it means to be constantly trying to wash our hands or cleanse or ward off bacteria, ward off like what that communicates, especially in this particular historical moment, in terms of water control, like what that communicates or suggests. Then I encourage y'all, I had a student do a presentation on foam in this class, and then I went down a rabbit. I was like, I got to know everything about foam. I got to know. So it's like you can just conduct some formalized curiosity work, which is what I call research, or love on. There are just so many aspects of water. I had a student that was actually in the class attending from Trinidad, and she looked up all of these documents and information related to water companies, like water management and water policy in Trinidad and Tobago, and did these visual kind of poems talking about her own family's relationship and the country's relationship to water policy and structures. Like I know way more than I want to about like Nestle as a water corporations, privatization, what Vicuna describes as actually kidnapping of water. So what it means to see water as a body that can actually be kidnapped or taken hostage. And then what else? Oh, okay, lastly, I also, if you were to write a new piece or to revise a piece that you have, that uses water as a means to pivot back and forth across time and space, like water as a way to kind of pivot or transition or to orient across time and space, thinking about water as an object specifically, and drawing from your memory and imagination. Okay, so I will stop there, and then I will look at the chat. So I think, Sarah, I spoke to your comment on the funeral processes. And Russell, I'm actually not aware of the Vanport, Oregon flood in the 1940s, but I have written that down and will look into it. Flood history and flash flood histories are absolutely fascinating. Historically, even in present contemporary terms. So looking at, flood documentation, what was lost is very interesting. Christopher's commenting, gums is so great. Yes, recommend. This is in also the Emergent Strategy series. So these are wonderful, wonderful texts. Okay, the Blue Clerk. Yes, Riley, yes. The Blue Clerk is always with us also. Yes, yes, yes. Secrets of Whales, Jana's offering. Yes, wonderful. Thank you, Jana. And then Sarah offering that beached whales are actually very bad for the ocean's food network, because not only do benthic animals feed on dead whales, but a lot of smaller creatures feed on what's called marine snow, which is essentially the decaying shedding cells of larger dead animals drifting in the ocean currents. Lovely. Yes. Yes. I actually also, to that point, Sarah, as it relates to, because y'all know, for some of you that have been with me over time here, I'm very interested also in taxidermy. And I'm going to go to the Denver Museum of Science and Nature when it reopens to the public for behind the scenes to look at some pelts. Grizzly bears were rendered extinct in the state of Colorado, I think in the 1970s. And so they have the last grizzly bear pelt there. And the pelt is actually covered in arsenic. You need to wear gloves to make sure that you don't have like the mites, to make sure that it doesn't disintegrate. It like repels the, I guess, critters, things that grow in it. And so this constant need to preserve, like what happens in a museum, preserving or maintaining something, as opposed to the natural process of life decomposing in the water. So to your point, Sarah, when these whales end up becoming beached or existing on the sand or on land, that is not actually where they need to be in the life cycle, and they are integral to the rest of life development actually staying in the water. But that kind of runs in contrast to our notions of like museum preservation or archiving. Oh, Cheryl, okay, so on the Oregon coast in the 70s, a whale washed up and they blew it up to dispose of it. I will definitely look into this also. There's an episode, I think the show is called Love, Death, and Robots on Netflix, where a beached kind of human giant washes up, and we watch in the episode, they're kind of these microfilms, mini films, what happens to this body over time. So that's interesting. Okay, and Sarah, I do remember, I think Sarah, also you worked at the aquarium, if I recall correctly. They are saying that there's a taxidermied 85-year-old 30-pound lobster. So yes, we'll end on that note. When I come back to the area, I will have to go to the Seaside Aquarium. I didn't know, in my own limited knowledge, actually, that lobsters could be taxidermied, but this is why it's a learning environment and ecosystem. Teaching and learning are simultaneously happening. And Cheryl, I will definitely look at this video, hopefully maybe at a later date, of the dead whale disposal process.
Hey y'all, let's give Alison a big round of applause.